There is a study, now cited by wealth managers all over the world, that found something uncomfortable. 70% of wealthy families lose their fortune by the second generation. 90% lose it by the third. Not because the money ran out, because the knowledge never got passed down with it. Old money families that actually survive across generations don't just leave behind property, portfolios, and paperwork. They leave behind a set of financial rules. Rules that are almost never written into any legal document, never taught in a finance class, and almost never spoken about outside the family. Today, we're translating that invisible part into plain language. Not tax code, we've covered that ground before. Today is about the behavioral architecture, the quiet rules about lending, spending, insurance, marriage, and money, conversations that determine whether a fortune lasts one generation or 10. If you want the operating manual old money hands down, but never publishes, subscribe now. This channel decodes the real infrastructure behind generational wealth every week. The third generation curse, and why it's not about money. Let's start with the statistic properly, because it deserves more than a headline. A 20-year study by the Williams Group, tracking 3,200 wealthy families, found that 70% of them lost their wealth by the second generation, and a stunning 90% lost it by the third. Researchers who followed up on this pattern identified the actual causes, and the results surprised a lot of financial professionals who assumed the culprit would be bad investments or market crashes. The study, led by Roy Williams and Vic Pricer, found that wealth erosion is typically caused by three silent killers: a breakdown in family trust and communication, unprepared heirs, and weak estate, tax, and liquidity structures. Notice that only one of those three causes is technical. Two of them are cultural. In most households, financial topics are either off-limits or vague. Parents don't want to create dependency or entitlement, and children don't know how or when to ask. So when wealth changes hands, it arrives with surprise, confusion, or conflict instead of a plan. This is the founding insight behind everything else in this video. Old money families that beat these odds didn't necessarily have better lawyers. They had a different relationship with the subject of money itself, one where financial literacy was treated the way some families treat religious instruction or a family trade, something deliberately taught, generation after generation, starting early. So let's walk through what that actually looks like in practice. Rule by rule. Rule 1. The family doesn't borrow from the bank. It borrows from itself. Here's a number most people never sit with. Over the life of a typical mortgage, a family can pay roughly $300,000 in interest on a $500,000 home loan. Add in auto loans, business loans, and credit lines across a lifetime, and a family can easily send $500,000 to outside banks over 30 years. Money that leaves the family system permanently. Old money's answer to this is a structure with a plain, almost folksy name: the family bank. The idea is simple in concept, sophisticated in execution. Instead of children and grandchildren borrowing from a commercial bank, they borrow from a family trust or entity, which acts as a private lender inside the family. The rising generation still has to qualify, still signs a promissory note, still makes payments on a schedule, but instead of enriching a stranger's shareholders, the interest they pay flows back into the family's own capital pool, to be lent out again to the next relative who needs it. A family bank can support structured, phased wealth transfer through intrafamily loans, education-based grants, and equity stakes in family ventures, mechanisms that promote financial responsibility while keeping control inside the family. There's a critical legal detail that keeps this from just being an informal handshake deal, and it's worth understanding because it's the difference between a smart strategy and an IRS audit. If a family loan charges interest at least equal to the IRS's applicable federal rate, or AFR, in effect for the month the loan is made, the IRS generally respects it as a genuine loan rather than a disguised gift. Charge less than that rate, and the IRS can impute the missing interest as income to the lender and treat the shortfall as a taxable gift to the borrower. Here's where it gets genuinely elegant as a wealth transfer tool, separate from the interest savings angle. If the borrower invests the loan proceeds in something that grows faster than the AFR, the excess return belongs entirely to the borrower, with no gift or estate tax consequence, because the lender only ever expected repayment of principal and interest, not a share of the upside. In other words, the family patriarch or matriarch lends money at, say, 4%. The next generation invests it and earns 9%. That extra 5% has just moved to the next generation, quietly, without touching a single dollar of the lifetime gift tax exemption. But the more important function of the family bank isn't financial engineering, it's behavioral training. Rather than giving heirs money with no strings attached, a family bank strategy typically requires them to apply for funds and justify their use, building real skills in budgeting, planning, and financial communication that matter enormously for long-term stewardship. Many families formalize this into an actual loan committee, a group of family members across generations who review applications, set repayment terms, and track progress, building transparency and shared accountability into the process. This is, in effect, old money's version of a rite of passage. Before you can access serious family capital, you present a plan, defend it in front of people who love you but won't rubber stamp bad decisions, and then you're accountable for paying it back. That single habit, treating family money as capital that must be justified, not an entitlement, is doing more to preserve fortunes across generations than any tax strategy could on its own. This is exactly the kind of mechanism most content about old money skips entirely. If this is opening your eyes, drop a comment with the word ledger, so I know to keep going deeper on these systems. I read every one. Rule 2. Never touch the principal. If there's one phrase that shows up, in some form, in nearly every multi-generational family's private conversations, it's this: never touch the principal. The idea is almost embarrassingly simple, which is probably why it works. A family accumulates a pool of capital. That capital is invested. The family lives off the income and growth the capital generates, dividends, interest, modest planned withdrawals, but the underlying principle itself is treated as almost sacred, untouchable, meant to be handed to the next generation intact or larger than it was received. Integrated estate plans built around this principle often include dynasty provisions in both revocable and irrevocable trusts that explicitly limit distributions so they never exceed the principal. Meaning the legal document itself enforces the family's cultural rule, so that no single generation, no matter how persuasive or desperate, can spend down the core asset base. This does something subtle but powerful to a family's psychology. It reframes wealth from being a pile of money to be enjoyed into being a machine that produces an income stream to be enjoyed, a permanent distinction. You can spend the fruit, you never eat the tree. This single mental model explains a huge amount of old money behavior that looks strange to outsiders. The reluctance to sell the family home, even when it would be more profitable. The resistance to liquidating a long-held stock position, even during a bull market. The instinct to lease or lend against an asset, rather than sell it outright. It isn't always the mathematically optimal move in any single year. But compounded across 80 or 100 years, a family that simply refuses to spend its core capital and lets that capital compound quietly in the background ends up dramatically wealthier than one that treats each windfall as spendable. There's a reason wealth managers describe this as a silent strategy. It requires no clever paperwork at all. It requires discipline, repeated for decades, transmitted as a value rather than as a rule imposed from outside. Families that succeed at this usually make it explicit early. Children are told, often before they're old enough to fully grasp what it means, that a category of money exists that is simply not for spending. Ever. Rule 3. Liquidity is planned. Years in advance, not found in a crisis. Here's a problem that catches even genuinely wealthy families off guard. Most of a family's net worth is illiquid. It's tied up in a business, in real estate, in long-held stock positions. Assets that can't be quickly converted to cash without either a fire sale discount or a large unwanted tax bill. Old money solves this problem long before it becomes a crisis, using a tool that sounds almost boringly conventional. Life insurance, held inside a specific legal wrapper called an irrevocable life insurance trust, or ILIT. Here's the mechanism. An ILIT allows the benefits from a life insurance policy to bypass estate taxes entirely because the trust, not the individual, legally owns the policy. Without this structure, a $5 million life insurance policy simply adds $5 million to a person's taxable estate, potentially triggering federal estate tax on the full amount. Move that same policy inside an ILIT, and the death benefit goes directly to the trust and then out to beneficiaries, completely bypassing the taxable estate. But the tax benefit almost isn't the point. The real function is liquidity on demand, at the exact moment a family needs it most. An ILIT can provide a source of liquidity in the insured's estate, cash that can pay estate taxes, settle debts, buy out a sibling share of a family business, or simply cover expenses without forcing anyone to sell the family's core, illiquid assets under time pressure. Think about what this prevents. Without planned liquidity, a family that suddenly owes a large tax bill or needs to buy out an heir who wants cash instead of shares is forced to sell the business, the building, or the land, often at a discount, often to an outside buyer, often destroying decades of patient compounding in a matter of weeks. A well-funded ILIT means the family never has to make a decision that big while grieving. There is a real trade-off worth naming honestly. Once a policy is placed in an ILIT, the grantor gives up control permanently. They can't change beneficiaries or access the cash value ever again. And there's a 3-year rule to watch for. If an existing policy is transferred into the trust and the insured dies within 3 years of that transfer, the proceeds get pulled back into the taxable estate anyway, defeating the purpose. Which is why sophisticated families typically have the trust apply for and buy a brand new policy directly, sidestepping that rule entirely. The broader lesson under all of this: old money treats liquidity planning as a permanent standing project, reviewed regularly, funded years or decades ahead of need, rather than something scrambled together after a crisis has already started. The insurance policy isn't really about death. It's about making sure the rest of the family's rules, never touch the principal, don't fire sell the business, remain possible to follow, even under the worst circumstances. If terms like ILIT and estate liquidity sound intimidating, don't worry. That's exactly why this channel exists, to translate this language into something usable. Subscribe so the rest of this series doesn't get lost in your feed. Rule 4. Money that marries in is protected before the wedding. This next rule is one families almost never discuss publicly, and yet it's one of the most consistently applied habits in old money circles. Before significant family capital is entrusted to the next generation, that capital is protected from the possibility of divorce. This isn't about distrust of a future spouse as a person. It's about applying the same discipline to marriage that the family applies to every other point where wealth changes hands, treating it as a transition that deserves planning, not improvisation. The most direct tool is the prenuptial agreement, which clearly defines which assets remain separate property regardless of what happens to the marriage. But old money families frequently pair this with something more structural and less personal, keeping inherited and gifted wealth inside trusts, rather than distributing it outright to a married child. Here's why that distinction matters so much. Assets held inside a properly structured trust, rather than titled directly in a married child's name, generally remain the trust's property, not marital property, even through a divorce. The mechanism is legal and impersonal. It's not "we don't trust your spouse." It's the family's capital rules apply the same way to every generation, regardless of who marries in. This is one of the quiet reasons dynasty trusts and family bank structures, discussed earlier, do double duty. They preserve wealth across generations and insulate it from the ordinary risks of individual lives, including the roughly even odds that any given marriage doesn't last. Families that get this right tend to frame it, internally, not as suspicion, but as consistency. The money was never fully given to any one person to begin with. It was always managed on behalf of the family line, the way a family business passes management, not raw ownership, to whoever runs it next. A spouse marrying into a family like this isn't excluded from a good life. They're simply marrying into a system that was built long before they arrived to survive far longer than any single relationship. Rule 5. Financial education starts decades before inheritance. Every rule covered so far, the family bank, the untouched principal, the pre-funded liquidity, the marital protections, depends entirely on one final unglamorous ingredient: heirs who actually understand what they're managing. This is the piece the research keeps flagging as the real point of failure. Many heirs are well educated in the conventional sense, but not wealth prepared. They inherit assets without understanding tax consequences, liquidity needs, investment structures, or governance responsibilities. They're handed paperwork, not preparation. Families that beat the third-generation curse treat financial education the way they'd treat a professional apprenticeship: structured, incremental, and starting far earlier than most people would expect. Success typically involves periodic family assemblies, an active family council, and a family constitution, a non-binding document articulating the family's mission, values, lending criteria, and expectations for how members participate in the family's financial life. This constitution isn't a legal contract. Nobody can be sued for violating it. Its power is cultural. It answers, in writing, questions that most families never actually discuss out loud. What is this money for? What does the family expect of someone who wants a loan from the family bank? What happens if a family member wants to sell their stake in a business the rest of the family wants to keep? Writing the answers down once prevents years of ambiguity, resentment, and the surprise, confusion, or conflict that researchers identified as the leading cause of wealth collapse. And the involvement starts young, often startlingly young by conventional standards. Children sit in on simplified versions of family meetings before they're teenagers. Teenagers manage small, discretionary accounts, with real, if modest, money and answer for the results. Young adults apply to the Family Loan Committee for actual capital, present real plans, and either succeed or fail with real consequences. By the time a member of the family is old enough to inherit a meaningful share of the family's capital, they've already spent a decade or more practicing the habits the money requires. The same way a family that owns a farm doesn't hand the tractor keys to a child who has never walked the fields. This is the part almost nobody talks about in old money content, the part where the aesthetic ends and the actual work of raising financially literate heirs begins. If you want the mechanism first version of this world every week, hit subscribe and turn on notifications. Rule 6. The family never discusses net worth outside the family. The last rule is less a financial technique and more a discipline of information control, and it deserves its own moment because it protects everything else on this list. Old money families are, famously, reluctant to discuss the actual size of their wealth, not just with outsiders, but often even among extended family members who aren't part of the direct decision-making structure. This isn't paranoia, it's risk management. Every number disclosed is a number that can be used by a predatory suitor sizing up a potential spouse, by a lawsuit calculating what's worth pursuing, by a distant relative calibrating what they believe they're owed, by a friend or advisor with a product to sell that suddenly makes sense once they know what's available to spend. Silence in this context functions the same way a locked door functions for a vault. It's not that there's necessarily anything sinister behind it. It's that visibility itself creates exposure. Families that maintain this discipline generally extend it to their children early, teaching them, gently but firmly, that the specifics of family wealth are not conversation material outside the immediate family circle. In the same unremarkable way, a family might teach a child not to give out their home address to strangers. This rule is also, quietly, what makes the earlier rules sustainable. A family bank works best when it isn't a magnet for every distant cousin's business idea. A trust structure protecting a marriage works best when it was set up calmly, in advance, rather than announced as a negotiating position during a breakup. Financial education lands best in a home where money is discussed as a serious, private subject, not a public performance. The actual lesson. Here's what ties every rule in this video together. None of them are secrets in the sense of being hidden information. A family bank is just a trust that lends money. An ILIT is a life insurance policy with different ownership. A family constitution is just a document that writes down values most families never bother to say out loud. None of it requires access that an ordinary family couldn't, in principle, build for itself. What separates a family that keeps its wealth for 200 years from a family that loses it in 2 generations isn't the presence of a single brilliant financial trick. It's the accumulated weight of dozens of small, unglamorous, repeated habits, treating capital as something to be justified, not assumed, treating liquidity as something planned, not scrambled for, treating financial literacy as something taught early and often, not delivered all at once in a will. Old money doesn't just protect its money, it protects the habits that produce the money in the first place, and passes those down as carefully as the money itself. If this gave you a real look at the rules old money actually lives by, subscribe to Old Money Opulence. New investigations into the real mechanics behind generational wealth drop every week. And if you want to see exactly how the legal side of this works, watch the companion video linked on screen. How Old Money Legally Pays Less Tax walks through the trust structures and tax mechanisms that work hand in hand with everything covered today. Thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next.